Hi there once again, Vin Rogers Jr. speaking, and this is part two of the Shroud of Turin, which now resides in Torino. The last time we were talking about the photographer, an amateur photographer, Secondo Pio, who in the year 1898 took pictures of the shroud, and miracle of miracles, when he expected to see a negative, instead he got a positive. And we won't bother zooming, but this is what he saw on his negative, which would seem to have been a miracle. And we'll talk about that as we go along, but right now, this is what really caused a great deal of excitement. Almost immediately, there was a fervor of societies for the preservation of the shroud and so forth. But there's a French, a very strange guy. He was a canon of the church. His name was Sir Ulysses Chevalier. He was thought to be probably the greatest scholar that France ever had. He was excited about it to the extent of that he knew that the thing was phony, and he sought to prove it. And so he went through the archives, and God knows, there must have been all over France, beside the Bibliothèque Nationale. At any rate, he came with over 40 documents having to do, these were contemporaneous documents, having to do with the shroud, which showed that the thing was a fraud. And one of the things that really damned it was this statement that I read from the previous broadcast, but I think it's interesting to repeat it, and I'll show you why. A contemporary, this is in 1449, that's about a century after the thing first appeared. This gentleman in the Netherlands is saying, "A certain sheet on which the shape of our Lord Jesus Christ has been skillfully painted with remarkable artistry, showing the outlines of all the limbs and with the feet, hands and sides stained with blood red, as if they had recently suffered stigmata and wounds." Well, blood, when blood is on a cloth or something like that, it's red when you first bleed. But after a week or two, it turns brown. It just oxidizes, turns brown. And if in sufficient quantities, it'll even turn just ugly black is what it will turn. But if you look at the shroud, and I've done this just to exaggerate the extent. One of the things on the shroud, of course, was, as this spokesman, 100 years after the event, the first exhibition of the cloth, he's seeing, here are these red stains. This is from Jesus' head, and of course this is from the crown of thorns. And here this is this livid red. Well, it's impossible. It has to be paint. It can't be blood. That should have signaled right away something was terribly wrong. Well, let's move forward. As I say, there were many guilds and societies for the preservation of the Turin shroud, and also for its worship and so forth. And in 1933, once again the cloth was shown, it was exhibited, and there was a Dr. Pierre Barbet who saw it. He was a French surgeon, actually. One look at that thing, hanging across the, draped over in the church, this 14-foot piece of cloth. He takes one look at it, falls on his knees in helpless devotion, goes back to Paris. Now, the guy was well connected, so he gets corpses. He starts nailing them to boards and hanging them from crosses and things like that. And from this, he has an entire anatomy of the situation with regard to the cloth. He wrote a book called A Doctor at Calvary. Oh, God. Anyway, in 1963, when reform in the church was on the march, and it was at that particular point it started to slow down because John the 23rd, the Pope, died, and a new Pope came into power. His name was Paul VI. And as you've followed many of my posts, I just feel almost sorry for the guy. He was just utterly incompetent in anything he undertook. And one of the first things of his papacy, believe it or not, he got a hold of the cardinal in Torino and told him, he says, "I've got some very special work I want you to do." And of course, what it was to look at the shroud. And so they had a secret commission in 1969 to look at the shroud. They schlepped it out of the church. It was in one of those regular boxes, you know. Take it out a side door in chapel and spread it out. And a bunch of scientists, I'm not even sure we know who they were, but it doesn't matter. At least we don't know all of them, let me put it that way. But what they essentially said was that the cloth was strong enough that it could stand the rigors of examination, and that it might be possible through scientific means to authenticate or to expose the thing as a fraud, but that scientific work could be done. So this cloth is put away once again. 1973, it's on exhibition again. It's on exhibition anytime they need money, because the lines out there, they're stretched for miles. People want to see this, throw the money. It's a money machine. 1973, this time it's on television. It's on color television. The whole world is now involved, not just the people of Torino. No. The whole world is in the thrall of this thing. The Pope himself was said to have uttered something to the effect, "This most holy relic." Well, the church had never taken a position on to whether or not it was a relic or not. They've always been very candy-assed about it, to tell you the truth. They like to play it both ways, so that if it is proved a fraud, they'll say, well, we never guaranteed it anyway. When the exhibition was over, after the world press had got it and taken all kinds of pictures, the cloth was removed to a side chapel once again, and another commission, this time of really first-class scientists, and they were all Catholics, but they knew what they were doing. They were good, and the church should have paid attention. One of them was a Professor Silvio Curto. He was the curator of the Egyptian collection at the Turin Museum. He was an expert on that period of history. Plus, he knew an awful lot about the fabrics and so forth. And one of the first things that he got upset about was the color of these colors on the cloth. That didn't make any sense. They had nothing to do with blood. And moreover, he was very suspicious of the weave of the cloth. The cloth was almost like a herringbone. Well, they didn't weave cloth like that at the time of Jesus in the first century. And but they were weaving it like crazy in 1357, when the cloth was first being shown as a relic. By then, herringbone was very common. So you get a little suspicious. Another of the experts was a Naomi Gabrielli. And this is amazing because, the Catholic Church is a boys' club. You don't have women fooling around. They let them wash the dishes and wash the priest's underwear and that kind of. Don't have them. They're not experts. You don't have it. But for some reason, they had this woman. And she was an expert on late medieval and early Renaissance art. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. She could look at this thing. She could tell whether, just from its style, maybe it would betray itself as being genuine or not. She immediately recognized it as being a medieval representation of the figure, the face, and all the rest of it. And she said she thought it might be some sort of a printing process. Bingo, she got it right, because that's what it was, and we'll get to that eventually. Another one of the experts was a Giorgio Fracchi, who was a forensic expert, and he examined the cloth from one end to the other, and he decided he found no blood, and he used test after test after test for blood. He couldn't come up with a drop of blood any place on that cloth. And so he was, in regard to the colors that we saw here, these red things, he couldn't account for them. Nor did he try. And that was used later by the shroud nuts, let's put it that way. The fact that he couldn't say what caused the colors was enough just to disregard anything he said further, forgetting the fact that he said there is no blood. Now here's the crazy thing. I don't know whether Pope Paul was the one responsible, but I think it's a good chance. They were appalled at this result. They didn't want this result. They should have been cautious. I mean, right now, everything about this cloth, every single thing, historical examinations, all have shown it's a fraud. Don't go for it. They did. There was an American group, Americans this time. They call themselves STURP, S-T-U-R-P, Shroud of Turin Research Project. They were mostly Catholics. The majority of them had no business being on there. They had no scientific training whatsoever. One of the heads of the thing was Eric Jumper. He was an officer in the Air Force and became in recent years had been the head of the Air Force in Washington D.C. Wow. Anyway, he and John Jackson were experts in imaging, and they took these images of the figure on this cloth, and by various taking angles and stuff like that, they could recreate. They could actually make a sculpture of Jesus, and did. Well, it was all cockeyed, of course. Didn't make a part of it. It had nothing to do with science. There were those that examined the cloth and found iron oxide on the cloth, which they immediately thought hemoglobin. That's blood. Well, they were very careless. They did not have tests which absolutely would rule blood in or out. They didn't do that. And when asked about the color, now they were ready with an explanation. They said it was bilirubin. Well, bilirubin is I think it's an excretion of the liver. It wouldn't have caused a color like that. And even over time, all it would just turn kind of a dirty brown, not a vivid red. Now, one member of the STURP team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, was a guy by the name of Walter McCrone. Now, Walter McCrone never went to Turin to see the cloth. The other members did. They stayed there for 5 days, poking it, subjecting it to X-rays and ultraviolet light and what God knows what. Walter McCrone, he was a world expert on microscopes and the examination of particles. And his offices are in Chicago. He's dead now, but he was an expert at art forgery. Now, they couldn't have picked a better man. And they were discouraged that they had picked him, because he right away, the moment he started his work, he determined that the thing was a fraud. That the most of the image that you see on the thing is produced by what was known as Venetian red, and I have some here, believe it or not. Maybe Ski can get it close. You see, that's pretty livid. What that is, what I have here is what's called jeweler's rouge. It was used for many years. I don't think because it's such a mess. You get this on your clothing, you'll never get it off. It's a red powder. It's simply iron oxide, and once mixed with, say, glue or, say, gelatin or something like that, you can apply it to cloth, and it looks exactly like blood. But the forger who forged this thing was not content simply to use the iron oxide. He went further, and in these blood areas, he applied not only a full strength of that stuff, he even applied vermilion, which is a salt of mercury. I think mercury chloride or one of them. Anyway, it's a livid red, and also rose madder, which is it's not a pigment, it's actually a stain, which is the medieval artists derived from the boiling of certain herbs. So right there, you knew right away. He also discovered that the whole cloth had been covered with a kind of they'd take bones and skin of animals and boil them in water and then strain the matter, and then you have this broth, which now can be used for tempera painting, actually, is what you can do. But if applied to the cloth, if you put it on one side of the cloth, now you can paint on that material, and it'll stick. It'll cause the stuff to stick, because the stains on the cloth and and the image, they didn't all penetrate through the cloth. You can see that it would apply to one side. You'd expect it, that if it had been true blood, it would have come through the other side of the cloth, and it doesn't. So there were many indications of Walter McCrone that this thing, and he informed the Stirp people of his findings, and they rejected it. They said, "You didn't consult with us. We're not going to publish your work," and so forth. And they published their own results, which were to the effect that the Shroud of Turin was datable to the 1st century at the time of Jesus, without any kind of convincing proof of it. They said that where you couldn't say that the image on the cloth was Jesus, certainly you couldn't disprove it. Well, that was like, come on, kidding us, aren't they? Well, so there the matter lies, but not quite. Everybody knew that if they could do a spectrometry on the cloth, they could date it through carbon-14 dating. I won't describe the mechanics of it, but it gives very accurate results. And at the time that these results were coming in from Stirp, there was no question of its being done, because they would have to take quite a big pieces of the shroud to do it. They would have taken about the size of a washcloth, maybe 3 or 4 such samples. It would have disfigured the thing, no question about it. So the church would never permit that. But what happened was that within the next few years, there was a new approach to the spectrometry. It was called accelerator mass spectrometry. Now they could date the cloth by a piece of cloth no bigger than a postage stamp. The church quickly agreed to it. What was interesting is that the Stirp people, these crazy people, Eric Jumper and John Jackson, now they were concerned about the test, that they wanted to be the ones to set the protocol for it and how to do it and everything else, which was ridiculous. They had no knowledge of how to do it and everything else. It had to be an independent group to undertake it. And so with reluctance, it went, as far as they were concerned, the Vatican went ahead and agreed to have the British Museum to be the referees on the test. And they would have the University of Arizona. They have the federal laboratories in Zurich, and yes, and the Oxford University. Those would be the 3 where the spectrometry would be done by 3 independent laboratories. Each one would get a sample of the shroud. They would also be given, each of those laboratories, 3 more samples, but from different cloth, whose date was known. Now, you see, if they can date the 3 samples and get it, and they come out independently and get the same date, then obviously you have they're calibrated. So that now, let's see what would happen when they would date the Shroud of Turin cloth. Once again, all the results were the same. They got all 4 pieces of cloth. They got it accurately, and their result was that it was 95% chance that the cloth was a forgery sometime between 1260 and 1390, right in the range of when that thing first appeared, and virtually 0 chance of its being anything from the 1st century. Now, you'd suppose that's the end. Oh, no. And it's the fault of the press. The press doesn't like to hurt feelings on things like this, and also because of its religious character. The press went, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago, they go to the people the Stirp people, these people that had it wrong. They never bothered to go to the people that had it right. There's only one press I found researching this thing, was the Los Angeles Times. They got it right. They went to the people who had got it right in the first place. The British press loved it. They asked one of the people, I think it was the guy that was from the British Museum, who was refereed it, and they asked him, said, his opinion about the cloth. He says it was a piece of cloth that some guy must have tarted it up to raise money or something like this. Of course, was historically true. He wasn't saying anything but the truth. So there you are, and you have the Pope on his knees before a piece of cloth that is just simply a piece of cloth, nothing more, nothing more. I want to leave with this note. Prometheus Press, you know the god Prometheus that gave fire to man? Prometheus Press. It's back in New York City. There are still books that can be gotten. This one, The Inquest on the Shroud of Turin by Joe Nickell. He wrote that in 1983. Which would be 5 years before the test. And he tells exactly how the image was formed, and I'll get that to you in a second. And moreover, here is the book by Walter McCrone, the man with his microscope, who examined the particles on the cloth and realized that they were just paint substance and that the thing was a medieval painting. Now there's only one thing left to explain. And I'll try to do it. It's kind of tough to do, but let's take a hit at it anyway. Do you see this interesting object here? There we go. That's simply a bronze, I should say. It's a bronze thing. It's a lady knitting. Now, if you take a piece, if you would put wet that down and put a piece of paper, let's say a piece of tissue paper or cloth or whatever, and you put it on that and just press it as flat as you can till it dries and pull it away, you would have an image which would turn out to be a negative image. And if you were to look at it, you'd get something like this result that we've seen here, that so confused the P.O. and so many other people, this negative image, which turned out to look like a positive. That will result. Now, many of you may have gone to cathedrals in England or on the continent, and you have done rubbings. They have brass plaques that are essentially negatives. And you put a piece of paper there, and you take a pencil or a crayon, and you rub on the paper, and you'll get a positive image from that. And a lot of people do that. It's a hobby. And there is the explanation for the image itself. And all the artist then had to do was to form lines around the figure a bit, tart it up by putting red blood here and there, and that was the story. So I've got nothing more to say. Goodbye.